Ever since the 90s, when video games started to explode into the massive industry that they are today, they have been regarded as a primarily male hobby. Being a girl who was into video games was seen as a rarity and elicited shocked reactions from male gamers or accusations that you were only pretending to be into gaming for male attention. Though far more girls play games nowadays, the term gamer girl still doesn't exactly have the best connotations. As a result of this bias, there's never been much effort within the gaming industry or community to cater towards female gamers and make them feel included. Female players have been around since the beginning, though. I'm sure we're all familiar with Pac-Man, one of the most popular arcade games of the 1980s. In 1982, gaming magazine Electronic Games reported that Pac-Man's player base included a significant number of women and girls. In response to this, Pac-Man's developers came out with what may be the very first game for girls, Miss Pac-Man, which featured a female protagonist. They were playing into the female character is just a sexy makeup-wearing version of the male character trope with this one, but it was the 80s, so I'll give them a pass. Miss Pac-Man became extremely popular and actually made some changes to the gameplay of the original that many fans considered to be improvements. In 1983, the first PC game developed with girls in mind was released, called Jenny of the Prairie for Apple II. It was an adventure game about a little girl who is lost in the prairie, whom the player must help survive by keeping her safe, fed, and watered while avoiding dangerous animals. Other than these two games, however, there really wasn't that much out there for girls who wanted games made for them. And by the 90s, video game marketing had become more male-centric than ever. I mean, it couldn't get any more obvious who video games were meant to be played by than when they released a console called the Game Boy. I'm still waiting for my Game Girl, Nintendo. By the mid-90s, a few developers had noticed this gap in the market of games targeted at girls. One of these was game designer Brenda Laurel, who posited that girls were not uninterested in gaming as many developers claimed, rather they just weren't interested in the types of games that were currently being made. In response to this, she founded production studio Purple Moon to create games specifically for girls. The studio produced two different series of CD-ROM games, Rocket and Secret Paths. They were visual novel-type games that revolved around things like social interaction and decision-making. Though successful, the games didn't quite become the runaway hits the developers were hoping for, and they were criticized for reinforcing gender roles and stereotypes. Unfortunately, Purple Moon didn't last very long, as they were purchased by Mattel in 1999 and shut down shortly thereafter. Speaking of Mattel, they actually released a game in the mid-90s that became very influential on the so-called Games for Girls movement. That game was Barbie Fashion Designer, also a CD-ROM game. The game was all about designing outfits for your Barbies. It was incredibly commercially successful, earning over $14 million in revenue. However, the game did draw similar criticisms as the Purple Moon games, that it contained very stereotypically feminine themes and not a whole lot of gameplay. Suddenly developers were waking up to the untapped potential of the female gamer market. They took many things from Barbie Fashion Designer that they carried into future games for girls. Traditionally feminine themes, simplistic gameplay, and in some cases, relying on pre-existing IP to make sales. The face of gaming changed drastically with the release of the Nintendo DS in 2004. It was a smash success, becoming the best-selling Nintendo console and handheld console of all time. With its popularity and the accessibility of many of its launch titles, such as Brain Age, the DS expanded gaming to a more casual audience that included women and girls. Nintendo reported that by 2006, 44% of all DS owners were female, and I can definitely back this up anecdotally. Myself, my sister, and many of my female friends owned a DS in the late 2000s. Nintendo seemed to embrace this newfound audience and included pink colorways of their updated versions of the DS Lite and DSi, because bitches love pink. I didn't own the pink DS Lite because I was in my not like the other girls era at the time, so I got the black and red one instead. But I did have the hot pink DSi because by that time I had entered my trying too hard to be like the other girls era. Yippee! This opened up the doors for a new era of girly games, giving us classics like Nintendogs and Cooking Mama. Those are good games though, and we're not here to talk about good games today, we're here to talk about dog shit. A less desirable byproduct of the DS's popularity was its propensity to attract shovelware. For those who aren't familiar, the term shovelware refers to low-budget, poor-quality video games released in hopes of being purchased by unsuspecting consumers. Obviously, shovelware existed prior to the release of the DS, but developers seem to flock to this console like groomers to a Super Smash Bros. Tournament to release their lowest-effort games yet in hopes of making a quick buck. This is likely due to the relatively low barrier to developing games for the DS and its popularity among children, who aren't likely to be the most discerning of quality. A whole slew of games for girls were released on the DS, which sounds like a good thing on paper, but quantity doesn't always equal quality, and a lot of these games could be considered shovelware. A significant portion of these girly shovelware games were tie-ins to TV shows, movies, toy lines, and other licensed IP. For example, there were approximately 1 billion games based on the various Disney movies and TV shows, most of which had a primarily female audience. Most of these games were pretty trash, because developers figure sales are already guaranteed thanks to the built-in audience of the media they were based on, so they don't have to put in any effort into actually making the game good. I remember I had an American Girl tie-in game for the DS as a kid that, if I remember correctly, I gave up on after only a couple hours because the gameplay was simultaneously boring and confusing, and I got stuck on this one part and just never had any desire to pick it back up again. Outside of licensed games, there were a few developers that started developing original titles for girls. One of these developers was none other than Ubisoft. Yes, I'm saying Ubisoft because Ubisoft sounds silly. Ubisoft is a French video game publisher founded in the late 80s with development studios all over the world. They're behind several popular video game series, including Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, Tom Clancy, Just Dance, and the Imagine series. With the rise of the DS, Ubisoft sought to expand into the casual gaming market as well. And one way they planned to do this was by developing an original series of games aimed at girls in the 6 to 14 age range. They announced the Imagine series at E3 in 2007, describing it as a line that allows girls to explore their favorite interests and hobbies in an interactive and entertaining way. These games were the result of Ubisoft purportedly conducting extensive lifestyle research on their target audience of young girls. Even if you've never played one of these games yourself, I'm sure you recognize them. There was a period of time where you could walk into the DS games section of Walmart or wherever, and these things would be taking up like 3/4 of the display. They all had similar cases featuring a smiling girl against a white background doing whatever activity the game was about. Some had a sticker on them that said #1 brand. According to who? The first games in the series were Imagine Fashion Designer, Imagine Animal Doctor, Imagine Babies with a Z, and Imagine MasterChef, all released in October of 2007. The series contains some 46 titles to date, and they varied pretty wildly in terms of content, gameplay, and quality. Despite the overall shovelware vibes of the games, apparently some of them were actually pretty decent. Imagine MasterChef was one of the first games released in the series. As the name implies, it is a cooking sim with gameplay very similar to the iconic Cooking Mama. Despite the photo of a girl on the cover, the game actually had a cute, chibi-like anime art style. You play as Lisa, a girl taking daily cooking lessons from celebrity chef Rachel Jones so she can cook her father a special dinner when he returns from his business trip. The gameplay consists of mini-games that use the DS's touchscreen, like cutting up vegetables, stirring cake batter, and flipping pancakes. IGN gave this game a fairly positive review, praising its appealing visual style, though they criticized the less than challenging gameplay, as it's pretty much impossible to mess up the recipes unless you're deliberately trying to, and the overly long cutscenes of Lisa talking to her bunny, Hopper. On the other end of the spectrum, we have entries like Imagine Babies with a Z, a babysitting sim where you play as a teenage girl taking care of the neighborhood infants. IGN rated this one far less favorably, noting its poor touchscreen controls and overall frustrating and confusing gameplay. I will give them a point for not having the most terrifying babies I've seen in a babysitting sim. Despite its negative reception from critics, Imagine Babies must have been a hit commercially or something, because Ubisoft released 2 Babies with a Z sequels, Imagine Party Babies and Imagine Babies Fashion. At the very least, these sequels seem to improve upon some of the shortcomings of the original Imagine Babies, with reviewers calling the minigames fun and diverse, and the controls solid and varied. Now, none of the Imagine games have particularly thrilling gameplay, but they are meant to be simulation games, not Dark Souls, so do they at least do that aspect of it well? Well, with some titles, apparently not. Imagine Wedding Designer is an example of a game that fails at both gameplay and simulation. IGN fucking hated this game. Not that IGN is like the be-all end-all opinion of whether a game is good or not, but they were really the only publication reviewing these games, and I'm sorry, but I wasn't about to go out there and play all 46 of them myself. Anyways, as the name implies, in Wedding Designer you play as a wedding designer. The bride will tell you what she wants for her wedding, and you must go around to various shops to pick things out for her. The gameplay is so simple as to be practically non-existent. All you have to do is select the options the bride smiles at, even if they contradict what she initially said she wanted, and not select the ones she frowns at, and the wedding will go off without a hitch. The player is also, for some reason, responsible for decorating the inside of the bride's house, dressing her in her everyday clothes, and designing the groom. Now, I'm not a wedding designer, so I suppose I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure none of those things are in the job description. Ostensibly, the Imagine series was created with the goal of allowing young girls to explore different careers, so you'd think the developers might be a bit more concerned with accuracy. But I guess they realized the duties of a wedding designer don't really translate to a game all that well, and had to add some other stuff in at the last minute. But even with all the extra nonsense, the game is only about half an hour long in all. There are only 6 different brides to design weddings for, and at least a third of the playtime is taken up by 2-minute-long unskippable cutscenes that play out each wedding. Critics also noted the blocky character models, stiff animation, and low-quality music. Overall, the game just seems incredibly rushed and low effort, signifying Ubisoft's prioritization of quantity over quality with this series. With the release of the 3DS in 2011, Ubisoft decided to continue the Imagine series on the new console. However, this didn't necessarily mean the games got any better. Imagine Fashion Designer 3D, released in 2012, again featured simplistic and superficial gameplay. You play as a budding fashion designer tasked with designing outfits for high-profile clients, except you don't get much in the way of creative freedom. You're more or less basing your designs off of a checklist of requirements supplied by the client. Similar to Wedding Designer, the game doesn't really delve into what a career as a fashion designer really consists of. The cutesy anime-inspired art style of the earlier games has been ditched by now in favor of more realistic-looking 3D character models, which in my opinion erases a lot of the charm the series had. I don't believe Ubisoft ever officially announced that they were discontinuing the Imagine series, but there hasn't been a new entry in over a decade at this point, with the last game, Imagine Championship Rider 3D, being released in 2013. Well before the end of the 3DS's lifespan. The games initially proved to be commercially successful, reaching 4 million sales in just their first year. However, I imagine this popularity must have waned over time for them to cut the series off so abruptly. I have a few theories as to why this may have been the case. For one thing, the games started to get a little repetitive. There are like 8 games that are fashion related, for instance, and I feel like if you've played one, you've probably played them all. Also, these games just didn't have a ton to offer, to be honest, like, especially some of the later entries. As I've noted numerous times, the gameplay was pretty simplistic, not presenting much of a challenge to players. This is fine if you're making your game for really little kids, but Ubisoft claimed their target audience was girls from ages 6 to 14. I'm sure I'm not just speaking for myself when I say that these games would have done absolutely nothing for me by age 14. Even as a younger kid, these were the types of games that may have caught my attention at first, but lost it pretty quickly once the novelty wore off, leaving me to never pick it up again. Games like MasterChef at least had some semblance of a unique story and characters, but the later games didn't even really have that. All of this is not how you create a loyal player base, in my opinion. In the end, these games are mostly fluff with no real substance, a concerning trend in girls' games that we'll talk more about in a bit. Ultimately, I don't really think this series did a whole lot to meaningfully advance the games for girls movement, since the criticisms of the girls' games from the 90s still apply here. The Imagine games mostly revolve around traditionally feminine careers and hobbies, like childcare, beauty, arts, animals, horseback riding, dance, figure skating, etc., with only a few games focusing on non-traditional careers for women like family doctor and detective. While Imagine may be one of the more prolific and well-known girly game series for the DS, it was certainly not the only one. Another series published by Ubisoft was Pets, with a Z. Pets actually started out in the mid-90s as a computer game published by PF Magic and was acquired by Ubisoft in 2001, who began making games under the Pets name for the GBA. The original PC game was your average pet sim where you could adopt adorable dogs with a Z and cats with a Z with big droopy eyes. The Ubisoft versions of pets, however, bore little resemblance both to the original game and to each other. For example, Pets Dogs 2 for the DS is ostensibly a virtual pet game, but the gameplay largely consists of playing minigames based on classic card and board games in order to win items to decorate your house with. The Wii and PS2 versions of the game with the exact same name, on the other hand, are completely different, being adventure games where you play as a dog, or a cat if you're playing the cat's version, trying to stop an evil wolf from destroying the world. The reason for these stark differences is that the Wii and DS versions are actually ports of two completely different Japanese games that were localized under the Pets name. I guess because they figured brand recognition would spur sales, which feels a little, I don't know, scammy to me. Like, if you were a fan of Pets in the 90s, you might pick up the Wii version expecting to revisit an old classic, only to start it up and be like, what the fuck is going on? There are a shit ton of other Pets games, including ones featuring other animals like hamsters and horses, and apparently they're all more or less just the same game. The franchise just kind of ended up with the reputation of being a dollar store Nintendogs. Another big publisher of Girly Shovelware, and just shovelware in general, was a company called THQ. As I mentioned earlier, licensed games and tie-ins were notorious for being shovelware, and THQ somehow managed to score licensing agreements with Disney, DreamWorks, and Nickelodeon, so they were shitting out tie-in games like no tomorrow. They did also produce some original titles, but I can't honestly say they were any better. And I'm speaking from experience here, because I actually owned one of these games as a kid. It was called Let's Ride, Friends Forever, a virtual pet game about raising and riding horses. Yes, I did have a horse girl phase. It definitely wasn't my favorite game to play, but I didn't remember it being too horrible. So I decided that I would revisit it for the first time in like 12 years to refresh my memory. So I booted up my totally real Nintendo DS and popped in the totally real game cartridge that I definitely still have in order to see what kind of magical gaming experience I was in for. When you first start up the game, you can enter your name, choose your gender, and customize your avatar, although the customization options are pretty limited and the graphics are, yeah. You then can choose and name your horse, but you can only choose from a handful of predetermined names. I'm sorry, but what are some of these names? This is my beautiful daughter, Wandella, the thoroughbred mare. You must care for your horse by feeding it, grooming it, walking with it, cleaning the stable, and treating it when it's sick or injured. You can't ride your horse right away, with the game saying that it's too young to be ridden if you try to select the ride option. This does make sense realistically, but from a gameplay perspective, it gives the game a very slow start. Caring for your horse merely consists of using the touchscreen to drag a comb around its body or an apple into its mouth, and it gets old pretty fast. You can participate in horse shows right from the beginning, but all that consists of is walking your horse around in a circle and receiving a score. Certainly a far cry from the fun little mini-games you play in the dog shows and Nintendogs. After 10 days of in-game time, your horse is finally fully grown and able to be ridden, but honestly, this doesn't really do much to make the game more entertaining. You can now participate in show jumping tournaments, but they're almost impossible to do well in thanks to the absolutely whack touchscreen controls. I remember being frustrated by this when I played the game on an actual DS as a child, and it wasn't any easier using a mouse on the emulator. Annoyingly, riding your horse seems to cause it to be sick or injured every 2 seconds, which, again, realistic because horses are made of glass, but doesn't really translate well to a game, because it forces you to have to constantly be buying medicines and bandages and returning to the stable to treat your horse. The game also doesn't tell you which medicines treat what ailments, so you might end up wasting all your money before you finally figure it out. Other than that, that's basically all there is to do in the game. Aside from the tedious, repetitive, and lackluster gameplay and hideous graphics, the sound design is pretty garbage too. There's literally just one song that plays on repeat throughout the whole game with zero sound effects or anything. Not so much as a whinny out of your beloved horse. To compare to some of the other games we've talked about, IGN gave this game a 2 out of 10. Lower than any of the Imagine games, so at least Ubisoft wasn't taking the biggest L. I have to say I would probably concur with that rating. The game was definitely a lot worse than I remember, and I already didn't remember it being great. Developers were for sure phoning it in on this one. THQ unsurprisingly ended up filing for bankruptcy in 2012, with their Montreal division being acquired by none other than Ubisoft themselves, thus putting an end to their monopoly on DS shovelware. Can we get some 07s in the chat? So as I said a little bit ago, we're seeing a pretty disheartening trend here of developers putting in the bare minimum, and sometimes not even, effort into making games for girls. Many developers seem to think that girls are only interested in games that contain stereotypically feminine themes, or that girls are inherently worse at video games than men, so the gameplay has to be dumbed down for them. I can't say I'm too surprised that this is the case, given that the gaming industry doesn't exactly have the best reputation for including women and treating them with respect. Most games in the 90s and 2000s solely featured male protagonists. Ubisoft pushed back against including female playable characters in Far Cry and Assassin's Creed, using the excuse that female character models were too difficult to animate. Okay, first of all, skill issue. And second of all, they had literally animated female character models prior to this. Apparently the real reason for this refusal was due to the belief that games with female characters wouldn't sell as well. Worse yet, in 2020, Ubisoft became embroiled in a wave of sexual misconduct allegations. Various upper-level employees were accused of sexual harassment, incidents that were apparently ignored by the company's HR. The environment of the Ubisoft offices was compared to that of a frat house, and they are far from the only studio to be accused of such things. Activision, Blizzard, and Riot have faced similar allegations, and probably even more studios that I don't know about. To me, this all speaks volumes about how the majority of the industry views women as an afterthought, not worth any meaningful consideration. They don't seem to realize that many women are interested in the same kinds of games as men. They may just want to feel more included by seeing themselves and marketing characters in the community and, not being met with misogyny and hostility at every turn. For instance, the FPS game Valorant has a player base that is 40% female. I'm not really into FPS games myself, but if I were to play one, something that would draw me to Valorant over a game like Call of Duty would be the diverse selection of playable characters, many of whom are female, and the appealing visual style of the game, as opposed to, generic-looking soldier dude ready to go commit some war crimes. No shade to my Ghost stands, though. Obviously, I can't speak for every woman gamer ever, but that's just my theory. A game theory, if you will. Pokemon is another game franchise that seemingly was initially made with boys in mind, given that you couldn't even play as a girl for the first gen and a half. And when I was a kid, it was definitely seen as more of a boys thing, but the demographics have shifted a lot in the past several years. In fact, a study found that the majority of Pokemon Go players are women. And I'm not trying to shame any girlies who do want to play a game with more feminine themes or simpler gameplay, but there is a way to make such a game and actually make it good. Just look at Animal Crossing, Stardew Valley, The Sims, just name a few. These games are good enough that they actually appeal to everyone, not just women. I know tons of dudes who play Animal Crossing. The difference between these games and shit like Imagine Babies with a Z and Let's Ride, Friends Forever, is that it feels like the people making them actually cared about what they were making and who they were making them for. Anyways, I'll get off my soapbox now, but basically, girls deserve better. Like I said, not all girly games are shitty, so if you want me to make a video talking about actually good girly games from my childhood, I would be more than happy to do so. And I also want to make it clear that I'm not trying to shit on anyone who enjoyed the Imagine games or any of the other games I mentioned today. Lord knows I enjoy all kinds of terrible media, so I'm not about to be the one to cast the first stone here. This was just a phenomenon I noticed that I thought would be interesting to explore. Feel free to tell me about any weird shovelware games, girly or otherwise, you played in your childhood down in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, liking and subscribing would be very much appreciated. I'll catch y'all in the next one.